I recently had a back and forth with a viewer in the comment section of one of my videos concerning whether superhero movies should be more silly or more serious. And during our discussion, it occurred to me that this person had no idea who not only superhero movies should be made for, but who comic books were meant for. I know I have gone over this briefly in many of my videos, but I think it is important enough to warrant its own. For the script of this video, I will use much of what I wrote in the comment section. I figure I already said it once, pretty nicely if I do say so myself, so why reinvent the wheel? Here we go. All the comics from their inception in the 30s up until the late 80s were for a certain demographic, 7 to 12-year-olds. But they were enjoyable by all. They weren't targeted toward kids the way they are now, with toot jokes and kid artwork. Children are capable of all the emotions of an adult, and deserve to be written to as such. Writers like Stan Lee and John Byrne understood that. They didn't have to write down to kids for it to be kid-friendly. Read Fantastic Four issues 50 through 70 and tell me they aren't kid-friendly while also being mature enough for adults to follow with bated breath. Many people call old comics silly. Okay, I'll bite. And? So what? Silly doesn't need to be juvenile and foolish. Silly, to me, is kid-friendly with comedy, fun, and good storytelling. Far preferable to serious, grim, and gritty. And where did anyone say that silly had to be goofball? Silly, to me, means a man can fly, along with his dog, monkey, and cat. Silly is fun, taking itself seriously, but not too seriously. 1950s Batman is silly, but the stories were loved better than anything that came later. Why do we know this? Because that was back in the time when 50,000 sales meant 50,000 readers, not 10,000 readers, if they're lucky, who each bought 5 copies for their collections or to get graded. Back in the day, when kids became teenagers, they turned to other hobbies than comics, often sports and girls. Did the industry panic? No, because it had a brand new crop of 7-year-olds every time the 12-year-olds turned 13. It was a perpetual cycle that worked for decades. But in the 90s, and actually starting in the late 80s, everyone stopped trying to foster the new generation, but catered to the one they already had. Wrestling, cartoons, TV, movies, and comics all collapsed when they tried to grow up with their audience in the 90s. No longer was it Hulk Hogan, you had Stone Cold Steve Austin. Gone were the Smurfs, they were now Ren and Stimpy. Goodbye, Perfect Strangers. Hello, Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. Goodbye, Care Bears movie. Hello, Toy Story. Kid-friendly content was thrown out for subversive, mature content. You might have had the moments of highs, but overall, it destroyed those industries. The same thing happened with comics. Instead of ignoring the letters from people who had obviously grown out of the medium like they had for decades, the publishers, editors, and writers began to give in to their demands. Then the stories were filled with grotesque anatomies, smut and swear-filled text, and plot lines so thin they were practically non-existent. John Byrne, who I always go back to, has his own analogy about this. A young man buys a sports car, then gets married and has a family, and then gets mad at the car company that his sports car doesn't suit his needs anymore. And then, to put the cherry on top of this insanity ice cream, the car company accommodates him. Very astute, that Mr. Byrne. I couldn't have said it better myself. 30 years later, we see where that has brought us. An 18 to 45-year-old demographic, and comics selling so low they wouldn't even see print back in the day. People would rather have this than silly? I say that's foolish. Comics are for kids, pure and simple. People will say, kids have video games to occupy themselves nowadays. They don't read comics. Kids had video games in the 80s and comics were still doing fine then. You know why they aren't reading comics anymore? Because there are no comics written for them. And most kids nowadays can't read. What grabs kids more than a superhero? Very little, if anything. But how is a kid supposed to read modern comics when it's all written for the modern 18 to 45-year-old demographic? And what's the alternative? Modern kiddie comics? Don't make me laugh. The modern kiddie comics fail because they are kiddie comics, not all ages comics. Kids don't want to be talked down to. They want fun, age-appropriate, engaging stories. Give them that, and the industry will return. This is why literacy rates are down lower than ever before. Comics like Richie Rich and books like Nancy Drew and the Hardy Boys were written so that kids could enjoy them as kids. Real stories with age-appropriate levels of intrigue, suspense, and action. We, as a society, have forced kids to grow up faster than they should, and comics, a kid's medium, has suffered. The comic book industry will never return. It is dead, and its still shambling counterfeit husk is dying now too. But there will always be back issues, and all the thousands of good stories that kept the industry alive for decades that now people look down upon because they're silly. Yes, I would prefer silly. Superheroes aren't supposed to be serious. Not the way people define serious nowadays. Verisimilitude is great, essential even. Treat the world of your story with respect. But serious? That's for grown adults who are too selfish to let go of their hobby, robbing the younger generation of the joy of comics because they wanted it to grow up with them. I truly hope you, dear viewer, are not one of those people. I thank you very much for listening. Until the next video.